U.S. Department of State expresses deep concern over Houthi rebels' violations against children in Yemen. Massam project demined thousands of Houthi rebels planted mines in Shabwa. International humanitarian organizations warn that Yemen is at the brink of a famine. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Shaza Abdelbey. Yesterday, the U.S. State Department expressed deep concern over violations committed by the Iran-backed militia against children in Yemen. In a number of tweets on its official account on Twitter, the State Department added, "We cannot ignore the ugly side of the conflict in Yemen, plus the violations that the Houthis continue to commit against children." This U.S. concern comes amid reports about Houthi recruitment of children in training camps. The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, discussed the need to urgently end all forms of violence and address the humanitarian crisis and economic difficulties due to the conflict in Yemen. Greenfield stressed the need for the Yemeni government to have basic services and achieve economic stability. There have been recent reports of Houthi rebels imposed forced recruitment on children and increased fear of the expansion of these operations, classified as violations against childhood, especially with the start of a new school year, a thing that is exploited by the terrorist militia as an easy hunt for recruitment. The UN Security Council in its session on Yemen accused Houthi rebels for blocking peace efforts. The council members added that the Houthi rebels are responsible for the failure to implement the four-point plan presented to the Yemeni parties. This plan includes immediate ceasefire, reopening of Sana'a airport, easing restrictions on Hodeidah port, and starting face-to-face political negotiations.
The United Nations Security Council again held a special session on Yemen. It's imperative to resume an inclusive Yemeni-led political process to reach a negotiated solution to the conflict, said Khalid Khairi, Assistant Secretary General for Middle East, Asia and Pacific, referring to the 2015 peace plan, which called for a nation ceasefire, reopening Sana'a airport, the easing of restrictions on fuel and goods flowing through Hodeidah port, and the resumption of face-to-face political negotiations. Mr. Khairi said the Houthis continue to make the opening of Hodeidah ports and Sana'a airport, as well as on the ending of what they call the aggression and occupation, conditions of their renewed participation in the political process. Meanwhile, military activity continues to ebb and flow, said Mr. Khairi, with sporadic fighting observed in Al Jawf and Taiz. Ma'rib remains the key strategic focus. Mr. Khairi called on the Houthis rebels to completely and immediately cease such attempts to achieve territorial gains by force. Turning to the issue of fuel supply, Mr. Khairi said the only 3 commercial fuel vessels were given clearance to berth at Hodeidah port since July. Cooking gas shortages have pushed wait times to 1 month for refilling empty cylinders. He pressed all parties to prioritize civilian needs and abstain from weaponizing the economy. On a different note, Henrietta Fore, Executive Director of the United Nations International Children Emergency Fund, UNICEF, acknowledged that little has changed since her last briefing on the situation 2 years ago. Each day, the violence and destruction wreak havoc on the lives of children and their families, she stressed. In 2021, 1.6 million children have been internally displaced due to the violence, she said, notably in Hodeidah and Ma'rib, while essential health, sanitation and education services are incredibly fragile and on the brink of total collapse, according to her. In Yemen, 1 child dies every 10 minutes from preventable causes, including malnutrition and vaccine-preventable diseases, she added. 2 million children are out of school in 1 in 6 schools can no longer be used. 2/3 of teachers haven't received a regular salary for 4 years due to the conflict. Having experienced or witnessed horrific violence, children will carry physical and emotional scars for their entire lives. Being a child in Yemen is the stuff of nightmares, the UNICEF chief added. War overshadows everything, said Martin Griffith, briefing the Council for the first time in his capacity as Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. The offensive in Ma'rib province and clashes among nearly 50 other front lines have reportedly killed or injured more than 1,200,000 civilians as collapsing public services deprive people of clean water, sanitation, education and healthcare, and cholera COVID-19 spread freely under such conditions. With 20 million in need of humanitarian assistance and protection, a fragile economy is pushing the country to the brink, he said. 5 million people are one step away from succumbing to famine and the diseases that go with it, while 10 million more are right behind them. Famine is not just a food problem, it's a symptom of much deeper collapse, Griffith warned. People are starving not because there is no food, but because they cannot afford it. The Under-Secretary General called for an end and immediate implementation of a definitive ceasefire, which would give desperate civilians a break and create the space needed to address the drivers of the crisis. In the end, beyond slogans and political point scoring, if the international community is serious about bringing peace to Yemen, there needs to be a strict strategy to counter the arrogance and bullying of the Houthi militia and force them accept all peace proposals. Only then peace can see way in Yemen.
Houthi militia shelled civilian neighborhoods in Hais Hodeidah. A missile projectile targeted Muhiddin area, plus shrapnels were dropped on the parliament member house, Nasser Zaid, and caused damage to the house and the neighboring houses. The bombing was heard throughout the city of Hais and sparked a state of fear and panic among the people, especially women and children. Houthi militia renewed their shelling on civilian houses in Al-Tuhaita, south of Al-Hodeidah. Sources said that the Iran-backed rebels targeted populated areas with sniper shots, causing panic and fear among civilians. Also in Al-Jabaliyah area, Houthis targeted people's farms. In Al-Fazza, however, the militia targeted people's houses and travelers in the roads of Tuhaita with direct fires. Since Houthi rebels seized the capital Sana'a in 2015, human rights violation acts have been committed on a daily basis as a thing which received local, regional, and international condemnation. These violations reach their climax with targeting women, neglecting all social and traditional norms that the Yemeni society prides on, especially with regards to treating women decently. This report has more on some of the recent Houthi militia violations that targeted women in the capital Sana'a.
It's not normal. I don't feel like a human being. I can't breathe properly like other human beings. This is what a Yemeni woman said when asked to express her situation in Yemen, as her shaky voice reflected the sadness, hurt, and fear which women in Yemen have come to experience on a daily basis. Women in Yemen from Ma'rib, Taiz, and Sana'a experience violence almost all the time. In Yemen, women are solely responsible for securing food, water, and medicine for their children. In the light of the Houthi militia's theft of humanitarian aid and to use women to serve the war, women in Houthi-controlled areas face various types of violations, including the confiscation of their right to express opinion and demonstrate, as the Houthis have imprisoned hundreds of women in their own prisons and practice various types of torture and violations against them. Although the gender roles shift can provide an opportunity to elevate women's status when she is equipped with adequate abilities, women as a result of this transition have been further subjected to violence. The conflict in Yemen has had a horrific impact on all civilians, generally women, and girls have been disproportionately affected. The fighting has left the country's people struggling with the dire economic crisis, damaged infrastructure, and collapsed services. But in addition, women have had to contend with limited mobility due to cultural gender norms. Also, since they are responsible for providing food and care in their homes, they have had to struggle with the challenges of limited access to food, water, sanitation, and healthcare services. which has seen a steady deterioration as the conflict continues. The Yemeni women should be heard, and international organizations should look forward on this issue.
Masan Project for Mine Clearing announced demining 4,744 healthy planted fields and unexploded devices in Shabwa. According to the project, the clearing operation including 1,500 anti-tank mines, 43 anti-personnel mines, and 3,250 unexploded devices. Massam officials outlined that these mines were planted in vital areas and pose a real threat to the local civilians. On the other hand, a member in the UN Experts Committee visited the headquarters of Massam Project in Aden and praised the program's efforts during 3 years in which around 200,070 mines, together with unexploded ammunition and explosive devices, have been cleared out. The coalition forces reported that the air defense obstructed and destroyed a Houthi drone that was in its way to target areas in Saudi Arabia. A statement from the coalition indicated that the explosive loaded drone was intended to target Khamis Mashat to south of Saudi Arabia, adding that the coalition takes the necessary procedures to protect civilians and their properties from the Houthi militia's attack. Turning to Ma'rib, where the coalition jets were reported to target Houthi military sites and vehicles in the city. Sources said that the coalition conducted 4 raids against locations and vehicles for Houthi militia in front of Rahba, southwest of Ma'rib. According to the sources, the coalition raids resulted in big losses of lives and equipment among Houthis. Famine in Yemen adds to the suffering of people who are struggling with war and bad economic conditions. The current level of famine in Yemen is unprecedented and is causing severe hardship for millions of people. The following report shed light on this issue.
It is a real crisis in a country that is already shattered by war. Yemen represents the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. It faces a host of dangers, the first of which is war. The country is suffering from displacement, COVID-19 pandemic, lack of necessities, and above all, people's inability to buy food. The current level of famine in Yemen is unprecedented and is causing severe hardship for millions of people. According to the World Food Programme, there are nearly 13 million of vulnerable people who lack food. Despite the ongoing humanitarian assistance, more than 16 million Yemenis are food insecure. The frightening nightmare of famine has returned to Yemen for the first time in 2 years in Hajjah, Amran, and Al Jawf. Over 5 million people in Yemen are on the brink of famine due to the conflict and the economic decline that have left families struggling to find enough food. The rate of child malnutrition is one of the highest in the world, and nutrition situation continues to deteriorate. A recent survey showed that almost 1/3 of the families have gaps in their diets. Malnutrition rates among women and children in Yemen remains among the highest in the world. More than 2 million children under 5 are in a bad need for treatment because of acute malnutrition. The humanitarian situation in Yemen is extremely fragile. Any disruption in the pipeline of critical supplies such as food, fuel, and medicine has the potential to bring millions of people closer to starvation and death. This famine problem in Yemen calls for the consciousness of the world to look more closely and to act in order to save millions of lives in the country.
Coming next, international aid agencies face field challenges in Houthi rebels-controlled areas.
ثالثتي على منطقة الروضة، استهدف الأطفال الأبرياء اللي يلعبوا في الشارع. بيدعي للسلام ويقول له للسلام يقتل أطفالنا يقتل أطفالنا الأبرياء.
أنا قلت افتجعت ولا قلنا يقع واحد صاروخ ثاني، طلعت البيت حقنا. أنا ألعب أنا وأصحابي والصاروخ الطرح.
Welcome back. Since the start of the conflict, thousands of livelihoods have been disrupted. Although international aid agencies are making great efforts to help reduce the suffering of people, yet their mission is still in accord with stupidness-filled challenges, especially in the Houthi rebels-controlled areas. This report has more details on this story.
Humanitarian organizations continue to face challenges working in Yemen during the time of war. The ongoing conflict in Yemen has created drastic economic issues, with over 1/3 of the population living below the poverty line, and more than 4 in 5 Yemenis are in need of emergency humanitarian assistance. Essential services have almost collapsed, leaving millions of people in Yemen vulnerable to a humanitarian crisis. The conflict zones are suffering from food insecurity. Conflict and economic declines are the main drivers of food insecurity in Yemen. Since the conflict started in 2015, livelihoods have been disrupted, reducing income opportunities and the ability to purchase food. Food insecurity is most severe in areas with active fighting. Victims of this large-scale violence are civilians. 24.3 million people, that represent 80% of the population, require humanitarian aid, and more than 4 million are still displaced due to the violence. Infrastructure has been damaged by the violence of the fighting. The health system in Yemen has been extremely weakened after 6 years of conflict. More than half of the health facilities in the country are out of service, while many of the functioning centers have very limited capacities. With this humanitarian crisis, the International Committee of the Red Cross is working relentlessly in the field, providing food and basic household equipment to as many people as possible. They are also supporting healthcare facilities while trying to improve the conditions of prisoners. The ICRC team, along with other humanitarian organizations, were able to help millions of people in Yemen, but millions are still in need of help. There is an old Yemeni saying that if you truly want to know how people are feeling, you should look into their eyes. The eyes reveal everything. Panic, loss, despair, death, and fear are all you can see in the eyes of people in Yemen.
The ongoing war in Yemen has created the crisis of displacement in the country that suffers already from a number of difficulties. 20 million people require humanitarian assistance. More than 4 million Yemeni people remain or displaced, and many others need food due to the deplorable economic situation. The following report has more details on this story.
In the vast arid desert between sand dunes with a temperature exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, more than 800 resident families and about 300 displaced families, most of them women and children, live in a very difficult humanitarian conditions. According to camps management for the displaced in Hajjah, more than 4,000 families, including 1,200 displaced families, face a humanitarian situation that is getting worse in light of the escalation of fighting between government forces and the Houthi rebels on the one hand, and the rising temperatures in the midst of a complete absence of international and humanitarian organizations on the other hand. Inside huts, tree branches and tents, ruined by high temperatures, winds and rains, the house of Muhammad al-Faidi, 72 years old, who has been displaced with his family from the city of Harad for more than 6 years, is lying on his traditional bed in one of the corners of the hut, which has not protected him from the high temperature for 3 years, causing him a disease made him lose his hearing. And near the hut of Muhammad al-Faidi lives 65 years old Fatima Ahmed, who was displaced with her 5 daughters from Abs district as a result of the ongoing conflict between government forces and the Houthi rebels. The International Organization for Migration announced the displacement of about 6,121 families, which is equivalent to 36,726 individuals, since the beginning of this year as a result of the current war. And during June 2021, the displacement of 169 families was monitored, the organization added. Earlier, the Yemeni government held the Houthi rebels fully responsible for obstructing and thwarting efforts to achieve peace and stop the war, stressing at the same time that its hand will remain outstretched for peace. In a related context, Mark Lowcock warned from lack of funding and its impact on the provision of services to those in need, and noted that UNICEF in August will reduce fuel subsidies for water and sanitation systems serving 3.4 million people. Also, the World Health Organization announced the provision of the security limit of the package of services that provides health care for 6 million people. More than $200 million in pledges made at the March event have yet to be dispersed, including from some of Yemen's largest donors, Lowcock added. The suffering of the displaced Yemenis has worsened as a result of the nearly 7 years war, amid the deplorable economic situations that serves no good.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced the registration of 45 new cases of the epidemic in 7 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 16 cases were recorded in Hadramaut, 9 in Aden, 10 in Lahj, 3 in Ma'rib, 4 in Taiz, 2 in Shabwa, and 1 in Al-Dala. Also 9 deaths were documented in Aden, 3 in Taiz, 1 in Hadramaut, 1 in Ma'rib, plus 13 recovered cases, 9 in Aden and 4 in Hadramaut. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 7,625, including 1,438 deaths and 4,702 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. The U.S. Department of State expresses deep concern over Houthi rebels' violations against children in Yemen. Massam project demined thousands of Houthi rebels planted mines in Shabwa. International organizations warn Yemen is at the brink of famine. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching.